Muy buenas tardes, compañeros y compañeras, colegas y amigos y estudiantes, todos y todas. Es una alegría estar aquí con ustedes en esta biblioteca tan linda, tan augusta. Y les quiero dar las gracias, les quiero agradecer por darme esta oportunidad de platicar un poquito sobre este libro, un libro que despliega una parte de mi vida. How y'all doing? I greet you in both my languages, in Salvadoran Spanish and Appalachian English. Just thanking you for coming today, and also I want to thank those who put this together, the Provost's office, the Counseling and Psychological Services, and the library. It's been so good to put this all together. And it's just wonderful to be in this library. It's one of the most beautiful libraries that you can come across. And as I said in Spanish, this is a chance for me to share with you a little bit from this book that unfolds, despliega, that unfolds a part of my life. It's part of my life. So first of all, I'll start with my name. Marcos McPeek Villatoro, that's a mouthful for some. But what I've done, I've taken the last names of both of my parents, as is a Latino tradition to take both of the last names of your parents. The McPeek was my father, Ralph, who was born on Clinch Mountain in East Tennessee, in the heart of the Appalachia. And the Villatoro was my mother, Amanda del Carmen, who was born in Usulután, El Salvador, in Central America. To which some people ask, oh, okay, how did that happen? How did you get this white guy from Appalachia with this brown woman from Central America together? How did that happen? It happened during World War II. My mother's family had immigrated to the United States in 1942. My mother became Rosie the Riveter, as did my grandmother. They worked on the docks, working on the ships. My dad then, in 1945, when the war was over, he got off of his ship in San Francisco. And he was going to take the long way home. He had the idea of buying a Harley Davidson and riding it from San Francisco all the way to East Tennessee. But then something happened along the way. He and my mother worked for a mutual boss he was a kind of ahead of his time. This is 1945. And he said, Ralph, Amanda, I think you two would really get along together. And he put them together over coffee. He's doing all the talking. And my mother told me later on, she said, I looked over at your father, and he was reading the San Francisco Chronicle, the newspaper. And my mother said to me, she said, I just remember, ay, esos ojos tan verdes, hombre, ojos verdes. He had green eyes. My dad had green eyes, which is the color of, back in Central America. Yeah, not red, but green. And suppose my dad was over reading the newspaper, but he was tucking his head over, he was just looking right over the newspaper and checking her out, and he said something like, yeah, boy. And they fell in love. They fell in love, and my father did not speak Spanish, and my mother did not speak English, so they got married. And after that, my mother, my dad bought that Harley Davidson, and he now had a wife to take back to Tennessee to meet the in-laws, and they wore leather chaps to cover their legs, leather jackets, leather gloves, a leather skin-tight helmet, all leather all over. And I can just try to remember, or try to recall, or try to put together an imagination. I haven't written about this yet, about my mother and father leaving San Francisco on that Harley. And for the first time, I could see my father up front saying something like, honey, you ready for the adventure of your life? And she in the back saying, ay, Ralph, tanto que quiero quererte, otro tanto. And boom, off they went from San Francisco to Tennessee. It was the first of 5 trips across the United States on that Harley. My mother would start missing her mother, or want pupusas, and they would head back to San Francisco. My dad would get a job in the coal mines over in Tennessee, and they would head back to there, back and forth. And I remember when I was 16 years old, we had a box of photos from that time. And there were those old yellowed photos from the 40s, and it had that deckled edge around it, you know, really beautiful photos. And I would flip through them, and I would look at them and my dad would be like, and my mom would be like, no, really? I mean, they were like this. And then they were on the Harley, and I remember as a 16-year-old thinking, God, this is so embarrassing and so sad, because there's nothing worse than recognizing that your parents were bigger badasses than you will ever be. And those were my parents. And they both show up in this book. this book deals with two themes going on at the same time. One is the search for one's Latino culture, my search for my Latino-ness, my Latinidad through the years, and how important that has been for me in this journey of life. And it also deals with mental illness and how that cultural journey has helped me not only maintain my health, but also to just, to be able to live a good life and a healthy life. So I'm going to read from two pieces from the book, two short pieces. One is, it begins the book, the first 2 pages of the book, and this one deals with the mental illness part. And then the second part deals with the looking for the Latino roots part. So this is called Speak of It, a memoir. Chapter 1. Annabelle prayed to CNN every night. She knelt before the television, her clasped hands pressed against her emaciated chest, and mumbled the prayers like a humble monk. She spoke directly to Mary, begging the Mother of God to intercede on her behalf, which meant Annabelle was old school Catholic. A lock of her long, unkept gray hair fell over one eye. Every time Anderson Cooper appeared after commercials, Annabelle crossed herself, touching her forehead, abdomen, left then right shoulders with stiff, bony fingers. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days, which might have been the case. Her sunken eyes and cheeks showed signs of starvation. I figured she had been living on the streets before they had brought her here. There were other patients in the rec room with me, women and men who sat silently and stared at a wall or a high window or a piece of furniture. One man who looked to be in his 30s, who had thick, red, frizzy hair, sat on a couch and patted his lap constantly. He mumbled names. Another man, bald, hefty, perhaps in his 50s, paced from one corner of the rec room to the other all day. A 4-inch wide yellow line ran from one side of the hallway of the psychiatric ward to the other, 10 feet from the main entrance. 2 orderlies stood in the neutral zone between the line and the swinging doors. I walked a bit too close. Cuidado, one of the men said, a young Latino who sported a thick, very well-groomed mustache and who looked big enough to tackle an SUV. He held his hands behind his back, like a soldier at ease, but still at the ready. He gestured with a nod of his head to the yellow line, smiled at me, and again said in firm Spanish to be careful and not to take another step. He was Central American. I could tell by his accent, similar to my mother's Salvadoran tone. I wanted to talk more with him, to keep the Spanish conversation alive. I craved it, desperately needed the Spanish to help me heal. But he turned to the other orderly, a white man who looked fresh out of college. They spoke in English and ignored me. Each morning, a nurse stood in the rec room and asked us what our goals were for the day. I said that all I wanted to do was rest. She nodded and said that was fine, but I couldn't stay in my room all day alone, even though there was no lock on the door, nor any object that I could have used. When I had arrived, they had taken my belt, my keys, and shoelaces. She suggested a therapy group session that focused on one of my 2 ailments, but she didn't push it. Some of us wandered between the cafeteria, the rec room, and a large patio outside, which the orderlies unlocked twice a day for us to get some sun and have a smoke. They lit our cigarettes and spoke with us as though we were colleagues on a break. I spoke with a patient who was Salvadoran. We chose Spanish as he struggled with English. I told him my family on my mother's side was from Usulután, a city in the eastern region of El Salvador. The slightest smile broke over his face, as though our connection lifted him out of whatever illness he was suffering. He said I didn't look guanaco, the nickname for Salvadorans, but more Italian, or maybe Argentinian. I told him my father was a gringo. As with the orderly at the front door, I needed to keep the Spanish going, the language that, for most of my life, had played a fundamental role in my survival. But he just nodded, took a draw from his cigarette, then fell back into his own dark place. My wife visited. Michelle, who had helped me through the days before the breakdown, could only do so much. She and I sat at a small, round table. It confused her how I smiled and asked how our 4 kids were doing. She said they were fine, but both of us knew they weren't. They had seen too much. Michelle was afraid. This was my first trip to a psych ward. I wanted to believe that my time there would be a respite for my family. But this 72-hour hold for them was as bad as all the howling at home. This time, I had lost all control. At one point, I had dropped to my knees and bashed my head against our kitchen's tile floor over and over again. I needed constant surveillance, something my family couldn't do on their own. I needed no self-control at the hospital. The staff did all the controlling. Along with my regular medications, 2 antipsychotics and 1 antidepressant, they dosed me with a little something extra to lessen the mania. The breakdown still pulsed through me. I couldn't read, I couldn't write, and had a hard time watching the news with praying Annabelle. But I wasn't screaming or running my head into a door or cutting myself. The seclusion of the ward, along with its rules and burly orderlies, kept me in check. The rules freed me. The monastic seal of the front door and its yellow line drawn on the floor kept the world from coming in. The new medication let me rest. I slept for the first time in 5 days. Something had set me off. Something had unleashed the 2 diseases in me. Something that felt cosmic, a lining up of the stars, a form of dark fate, or a mean game of chance among the gods. I don't believe that anymore. But sometimes, due to the way it went down, I have wondered if someone had intentionally set it up to try to break me, to get me to commit suicide. I wonder if he somehow made it happen. But that's giving him too much credit. I ended up in the hospital because of the internet. I had forgotten to renew my website, marcosvillatoro.com, where my books were listed. A pornography ring had bought it and stuck a porn site onto my page. It stripped out all of my writings and my biography. It wasn't just a general porn site, but one that sold incest rape videos. It was a cheaply constructed site with ostentatious photos of naked, supposed family members interlocked in violent sexual acts. There were buttons to click that took the visitor to the credit card page. Underneath the pictures, the wild font captions clarified, quote, "Brother, sister fucking, father, daughter, dick suck, son, mother, pussy eat." Whoever had built the site struggled with English. At the bottom, they'd written in tiny letters, all are these actors. A computer engineer friend figured out that the buyers of my name were from St. Petersburg, Russia. One of my books had recently been translated into Russian. Perhaps the pornographers thought my name got ample traffic, and that from among those who checked out my work, the site would grab the attention of a few perverts. But how did they know of my past? How was it that their website sold the thing so specific to my life? A week after seeing the web page, I broke the rim of a ceramic coffee cup against the edge of my desk, took a large shard of it, jabbed it into my forearm, and raked the skin toward my wrist, as though to connect the new cuts with an old scar. I slashed the other arm, my bicep and right thigh. Michelle and my 2 middle school sons found me shriveled up on the floor, blood stains on the wood, my clothes, and smeared over my skin. Even in the moment of the episode, I could see the horror in my son's eyes. Michelle leaned over me, and she touched my shoulder. I bellowed. It was too much for us all. The incest porn site had gone beyond the beyonds. So I refer in here that I have 2 ailments, and I'd like to touch upon each of them. One of is, as it alludes to in the reading, was that I was traumatized as a child. I was 6 years old, and an older relative sexually molested me for about a year. So that is the trauma. And when we talk about trauma, we're talking about something that has hurt you in such a deep way that it leaves an emotional scar there, and something that you have to deal with throughout your life. Sometimes for me, I'm not thinking about it at all. It's, far away, I'm busy, I'm with my family, I'm with friends, and you live your life. But other times, especially during times of stress or really high stress, it can come on, and then it's something to deal with and to stop and to think again about it. One of the things about trauma for me is that sometimes I feel like the next shoe is going to drop. You're just kind of always on waiting and see what's going to happen. So that's trauma. But the other illness that I have is now called bipolar, or what I really prefer to call is manic-depression, because to me, it kind of gets it more than the bipolar does. But bipolar, that's a scientific term, and it does make sense. But what is manic depression? Well, this came upon me when I was about 17 years old. No, in fact, it came upon me when I was 17 years old. You know how we live our life, and we live, ups and downs. And so our life can be like this, right? You have happy times and good times, and then you have rough times. And then you have happy times and rough times. And that's how you hope life goes on. But for the manic depressive, there's no that equilibrium going on. The manic person, it's genetic first. It's genetic, but it also can be connected to such things as trauma. But the manic person goes up. He or she or they don't stay in this area. They go up, and as they go up, it's a trickster. The mania part is a trickster. What it does is people think you're doing really great because you got so much energy, you got so much vibrancy. You can be the middle of the party, you can do the life of the party, and you have ideas, all sorts of different ideas that come up. And very creativity actually happens during manic phases at a certain point. But then things start to get awry. And you go up, and you're going up, and you start doing things that make no sense. One day I decided I'm going to write 3 novels in one day, right? Made sense at the time. I thought it would work out. And I didn't sleep. I couldn't sleep. The insomnia was working on me. Days would pass without sleep. And then you go to a certain place where the mania and the, is like that, for me, it turns into rage, anger, because it's as if the mind can handle only so much mania. And from there, it's like the story of Icarus. Icarus, in the old myth, was a boy whose dad made him wings out of wax and feathers. And he said, okay, you can fly, son, but don't fly too close to the sun, because you get in trouble. Well, what did Icarus do? He was a little manic himself. So he took off, and he flew, and he flew, and he flew, and he got to the sun, and the euphoria of the sun. Of course, it melted the wax, and the feathers came off, and that's where he comes to a certain high, and then drops into the sea. And that's what happens to the manic depressive. He drops into a morbid depression, and what I'll call, or what William Styron, the famous writer, called pure madness. And sometimes those old words, for me, make the most sense. Pure madness. It's a horrifying disease for yourself and for those around you. If left untreated, A manic depressive person could live 10 to 15 years less than the average lifespan if left untreated. And these are for different reasons. Alcoholism, drinking yourself to death, smoking yourself to death, drugs, shorten the lifespan, homelessness. And if you've ever noticed, if you've ever been out and you've seen some homeless folks who act erratic, probably a lot of mental illness that's going on there, right? So homelessness, which leads to starvation. That's another reason people die young. And suicide. And suicide is an issue with this illness. And I'm so glad last month was National Suicide Prevention Month. And what I like about that is it's talking about the issue, bringing it up. So it's not the taboo. So much of this is taboo. Mental illness, no, nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. Especially in some of our cultures, it's very, very, right? You don't talk about that. You just work through it. If treated, you can live a good life, relatively good life. I take the medications. I have a cocktail of 4 medications, 2 antipsychotics, an antidepressive, 1 for anxiety. I have family and friends around me, friends who understand what I have. It's a disability. You have to think about it as it's a disability. And they understand and they're with me for that. I live kind of an orderly life. I try to keep a certain sense of order in my days. Try to, hey, all of you, try to live life with less stress, which y'all can laugh now, right? Less stress. Look who I'm talking with, right? Yeah, a little stress is starting to come up in the semester. And the last thing for me, well, there's different ways I take care of myself, but there has been this road to Latino-ness. Now this is Latinx Heritage Month. And I love that because it gives a chance for those who are Latinos, Latinx, to celebrate the Latin American roots that we come from, right? And there's so many of us here, especially in Los Angeles. So it's a really wonderful time to celebrate that. And I celebrate it because, as I said, it had so much to do with taking care of myself. Now, to bring you into Latinx Heritage Month, I brought una amiga conmigo. My wife and I lived in Central America for a number of years, and we did adult education, I guess you would call it, but for those of you who are in theology, it was more liberation theology, in which you work together to deal with issues. We would do everything from sacramental work, we'd work on the sacraments, to dealing with land issues. We worked with poor people in both countries. And then after that, we spent 5 years in Alabama working with the Mexican migrant farm community. So we spent a lot of years in those venues, in those worlds. And when we had the adult education classes, the question of whether or not it was good was whether or not we had music. And people would say, how was the meeting? Oh, bien alegre, porque trajo la guitarra. Oh, it's a lot of fun because he brought the guitar. And the other one would say, no, muy triste, no trajo la guitarra. He didn't bring the guitar. So I bring the guitar with me today. I'm going to start with you one that many of you know. De colores se visten los campos en la primavera. De colores son los pajarillos que vienen de afuera. De colores es el arco iris que vemos lucir. Y por eso los grandes amores de muchos colores me gustan a mí. Y por eso los grandes amores de muchos colores me gustan a mí. Canta el gallo, ya sabes la canción. Canta el gallo con el kiri, 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 kiri. La gallina con el cara, 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 cara. Los polluelos con el pío, 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 pío. eso los grandes amores de muchos colores me gustan a mí. Y por eso los grandes amores de muchos colores me gustan a mí. De colores. Now, did you remember there was a movie called El Mariachi? It came out many, many years ago, and then it was followed, and it was a real independent one. I mean, it was really, but it really did well. And then there was a movie called Desperado with Antonio Banderas, and that's where this song comes from. Soy un hombre muy honrado y me gusta lo mejor. Las mujeres no me faltan, ni el dinero ni el amor. Jineteando en mi caballo por la sierra yo me voy. Las estrellas y la luna ellas me dicen dónde voy. Ay, 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 mi amor. Ay, mi chelita de mi corazón. Ay, 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 mi amor. Ay, mi chelita de mi corazón. Me gusta tocar guitarra, me gusta cantar el son. Mariachi me acompaña cuando canto mi canción. Me gusta tomar mis copas, aguardientes lo mejor. También el tequila blanco con su sal le da sabor. ¡Hey! ¡Ay, ay, 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 mi amor! ¡Ay, mi chelita de mi corazón! ¡Ay, ay, 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 mi amor! ¡Ay, mi chelita de mi corazón! Esa última nota, nunca la alcanzo. Nunca la alcanzo esa última nota. That last note always gets me. So anyway. So that is a celebration of our Latino heritage, Latinx heritage. I'm going to end with this one reading that has to do with everything. With some of you, especially our young folks, might groove with this experience. You might find it familiar. I hope so. I'm going to read from the question of Latinidad. Just a backstory real quickly. I was born in San Francisco, California, and I was raised in the Mission District. And everybody was Mexican, Central American, Honduran, all over the world. And my grandmother rented out her house on Cap Street to a lot of people. So there were always lots of folks in our house. And I remember, I lived there my first 4 years, and I can scantily remember going through the legs of people, so many legs, because they were all dancing. They held dances in my grandmother's house, and the music was playing. And I remember the smells that are coming out of the kitchen, the pupusas, the tortillas, the tamales, the picadillo, right? And then there's always horchata, too, for the kids, right? There was all this. But I remember the dancing and getting there, and then my grandmother would grab me, and she'd dance with me, and she was the one who showed me how to move the hips, you know? That's how you do it. That's how you do the hips. And they would all dance with me, and I remember that. And my mother said to me that I was bilingual, and in fact, I spoke more Spanish than I did English. Then we moved from San Francisco to East Tennessee, to my father's world. And you know how that is, where you're in one culture, and then you move to another culture, and assimilation begins. And so what happened was I started to lose my language because there was no one except my mother to talk with. And this is a strange thing, I'll put it on the side, but my dad had said to my mother when we moved to Tennessee, no more Spanish for this boy, only English from now on. And I don't exactly understand why he did that. He may have been worried about me, that I would stick out or something like that, or his own other reasons. It might be, racial reasons, I don't know. But I didn't have the Spanish. So I grew up then part of my life in Tennessee and started to lose my Latino roots. And this is where then, when I was a teenager, we made a trip that changed everything. When I was 19, my parents and I went to Mexico to visit an uncle there. We arrived on December 10th. On the 12th, we, along with half of Mexico, visited the Catholic Church in Tepeyac to see the cloth of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Thousands of people, mostly indigenous, walked on their knees to the church where Juan Diego's 400-year-old tilma, which is a type of serape, hung inside a glass cube. It had the image of Mary on its front, miraculously printed there by the Virgin herself. I didn't understand, but I was moved to see thousands of people on their bloody knees, singing and praying rosaries. I didn't know what to think, but I was thinking, fascinated. But there, in the church of Tepeyac, that was flooded with pilgrims from all over the nation, I felt that strange and overwhelming cultural shame of one who is Latino and doesn't know it. And that uncle of mine didn't help. Tío Paco was a pendejo. At the time, I didn't know that term. Some translate it as asshole, which doesn't even begin to grasp the power of the Spanish word. According to my mother, a pendejo is a singular hair of the scrotum.
Oh my.
That's quite the insult. Everyone saw Tío Paco as a charismatic man, full of life, a gentleman who liked his wine and danced with every woman in the room. But for me, in the beginning of the trip, Tío Paco was a pendejo. In El Salvador, he had been a teenage guerrilla during a failed insurrection. The dictator had ordered the massacre of more than 20,000 indigenous men and women, all of whom were killed within 2 months. Tío Paco escaped. He fled to Mexico, where he later established a small bookstore. But his love for the old country never waned. Now, during our winter vacation, Tío Paco told us the histories of El Salvador, Mexico, Cuba, the United States, like an enthusiastic professor, something that appealed to me. Although I didn't understand his lightning Spanish, Mama had to translate for me. Suddenly, he turned to me and said, "Y que vos guanaco, pero no te conoces?" My mother translated, "You're Salvadoran, but you don't even know who you are?" I turned mute. Shame and anger rose in me like bile. I walked to the other side of the bookstore, trying to escape in the shelves. I was surrounded by books, all in Spanish, and I didn't recognize any title nor the authors except one. Not his name, but the prize, Nobel. Gabriel Garcia Marquez had won it that year. I pulled the book off the shelf and studied the cover. I read the title aloud, and Tío Paco heard me. He looked at me, glanced at the copy of Cien Años de Soledad in my hand, 100 Years of Solitude, and he laughed at me. He said something between guffaws. It bothered my mother, but she didn't say anything. I marched to her side and asked, "What did he say?" She didn't want to translate it. Uncle Paco was still laughing. "What did he say?" She hesitated, but finally answered, "Your uncle says that you don't speak Spanish and you're going to read that book?" That book, the one that I was about to reshelve. Now I clutched it like a grenade, shook it at my uncle's face, and said to Mama, "You tell him I'm going to read this book, and someday I'll understand it." I think Tío Paco saw a few drops of Salvadoranness in my tantrum. He quit harassing me. Now he hauled me from one corner of Mexico to another. The Templo Mayor Teotihuacan, the Museum of Anthropology. He talked to me through my mother's translations. He spoke of the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Pipiles, and Nahuatl people with authority and veneration. He said to me, "Your people," while we stood before a Central American exhibit. Your people, your ancestry. One night at Tío Paco's house, I took a look at the novel. I translated the title in a whisper, 100 Years of Soledad. I didn't recognize that last word. 100 years of something. I opened the book and read aloud one of the most famous first lines in the history of global literature. Muchos años después, frente al pelotón de fusilamiento, el coronel Aureliano Buendía había de recordar aquella tarde remota en que su padre lo llevó a conocer el hielo, which in English is, many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendía remembered back to that long ago afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. Now this encapsulates the whole novel. The novel is kind of a circular novel when it comes to past and present. And so at first he's talking about the front many years later and facing before a firing squad. And then he talks back about his life growing up and discovering ice. So I'm going to read it one more time to compare it with what I came up with. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendía remembered back to that long ago afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. I recognize muchos, años, and hielo. Pelotón sounded familiar. Pelo? Ah, yes, hair. And fusilamiento, a fuselage? That's an airplane. Yes, of course. And tarde, the word tarde, that must mean tart, like a sweetbread. Okay, this made not much sense. So I wrote, many years in front of the airplane hair, Colonel Aureliano Buendía recorded a faraway Pop-Tart inside his dad, and they had some ice cream. I was on a roll and kept going, guessing the words of the first 10 lines and wrote the translation in my journal. The next morning I showed it to Tio Paco. He could read English. He read my translation, pressed his eyes closed, and handed the journal back. He said, "Ay, puchica." He walked to a bookshelf, took out a Spanish-English dictionary, handed it over, and he didn't charge me. He and Mexico had given me a focus. Now I longed to know my Salvadoran culture. We returned to the United States, back into a one-language world. But I had that book. In Mexico, with the dictionary, I had translated the first 3 pages. Now, back in college as a freshman, I pushed my homework to one side, placed the book on the desk, the dictionary beside it, and my journal at arm's reach. I recorded each word in its translation in columns of vocabulary, which I memorized 10, 20, then 30 words a day. They came rather easily. It felt as though I was slipping into the folds of my brain and reaching back to that 4-year-old who grew up in Spanish-dominated San Francisco. And my accent was similar to my mother's. Again, I chalked this up to having heard it while living in the Mission District. I read the pages of the novel aloud with the new vocabulary in my head and understood some of it, but not exactly. The scenes were so strange. The book began with a new world where things had no name. It was like Genesis, but not really, as there was no God. I kept translating, memorizing, reading out loud to exercise my tongue. It was like no other story I had ever read. Magic realism, the academics call it, a mix of the real with the otherworldly. It fascinated me, but something was missing, the community in which the novel was born. I was in the United States, living in a gringo, monolingual, magicless world. The book couldn't become fully alive here, not for me, a young man whose need to return to his Latino roots now ached to the bone. Thank you.